Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today I'm joined by Troy Rowan from the University of Tennessee, who is investigating using genomics to understand and predict economically important traits in beef cattle, with a particular emphasis on cow efficiency, local adaptation, and genetic approaches to increasing beef cattle sustainability. Troy, thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, good to be here, Ash.
Genetics is and breeding animals is a something that animal producers, farmers, ranchers have been doing, since Roman times, and it's also something that many of them love to do. They love to talk about. They're hugely proud of. So, do you want to just introduce us to genetics and livestock genetics and the power that has to really shape the animal production systems and the beef production system?
Yeah, I think genetics is has always been really interesting to me. I remember, I guess, just to go back to where my interest in genetics started. My dad had a bunch of old books, and the one that I loved the most was this like breeds of cattle, just sort of a very visual book that sort of explored all the worldwide diversity in cattle, and it had a bunch of these pictures sort of throughout time, and it was crazy to see these animals at the turn of the century that looked very similar to animals that we've got now, and then pictures from the 1950s and 60s where our animals were sort of at belt buckle height, these really tiny, pudgy, fat animals, and then we got to the 1980s and 90s, and we had these animals that were just huge, lean, 6 foot at the shoulder, and then now we're back to this sort of more moderate stage in our beef animals, and so it was just a really cool look at how intentional selection, even in the absence for a lot of that time, without selection tools, you can make a huge amount of change in an animal's phenotype and performance over a really short amount of time if you're putting effort into making those selection decisions for one trait or another. So that was always a really cool thing to look at. But as you sort of dig into it, and like you said, all the way back to Roman times and before then, right, our interactions with the progenitors to cattle pre-domestication, 12, 15,000 years ago, where we sort of get from this stage of hunting animals to actually cultivating and living beside them, I think is that's all genetics, right? We're making them fit our lifestyles better. And then very recently, right, we've sort of expanded the suite of things that we're interested in. Once you've got an animal tame enough to live amongst you, then you can start drilling into making it more productive. And we just sort of continued that over the last however long.
So, you think back to, old TV shows like the All Creatures Great and Small, many people who've been to veterinary school, big fans of James Herriot and all that sort
Right.
of stuff. And it's all visual. It's all, you might, the most sophisticated bit of, measuring technology you might have was, a tape measure to measure the height at the shoulders, say, and a set of weigh scales so you know how much the thing weighs. But it's all visual, and the old breeds, the Hereford with the white face or whatever was also hugely visual. But now, I guess in the last 40, 50 years, but also increasingly in the last 5, 10 years, the tools available to look at things with much greater resolution have changed. They're just chalk and cheese different. So how does that affect things, and what's the opportunities that come from these tools?
Yeah, that's something that I don't think I appreciated until fairly recently was the act of actually measuring animals in an objective way and including that in selection decisions is a very, very, very modern thing, right? We weren't routinely running animals across scales to collect weights until, the 1950s and 60s that were flowing back to breed societies. We didn't have selection tools, so I'm sure we'll talk about sort of EPDs and indexes, the things that our producers have that allow us to select on the estimated genetic component of traits. Those are we sort of live in that world as geneticists now, but those are fairly new creations, right? Sort of delivered to the industry at the earliest in the late 70s and sort of picked up steam in the 80s. But again, our ability to do all that is predicated on being able to measure these phenotypes on big numbers of animals and sort of get those in a central repository, and our ability to measure more different things, right? A scale is one thing, but we've sort of exploded in the number of different things that we've been able to actually capture those objective measurements on, and in turn start to develop selection tools for them, right? So whether that be things like enteric methane, whether that be things like carcass attributes on live animals through ultrasound. Really, the technologies have exploded there, and I think a lot of our growth in the genetic space in the next decade or two is going to be how do we leverage things like AI and computer vision, and some other precision technologies to capture these more granular and precise phenotypes that previously would have never been practical to measure on big groups of animals.
I think if we take a step back for a second and look at what a ruminant is, and essentially you've got the animal, the lungs, the heart, the organs, all that sort of stuff, but that's also carrying around this mobile fermentation vat that's full of hundreds of billions of microbes, bacteria, protozoa, archaea, etc., fungi. And that's the engine of the digestive system. So you've almost got an organism within an organism.
Yeah,
And, going back to new technologies, it wasn't, until we had genomics, most of those microbes are highly anaerobic. So as soon as you take them out of the room and they die. So
yeah,
people are trying to culture them for years, and all the interest ones died because took them out and put them in touch with oxygen.
right.
And now with genomics, you actually know what's in there. So you've got these different layers, and then there's some really great work also starting to look at nutrient density of the foods and the beef that's produced, or lamb, or whatever
Yep,
protein is produced. And one of the fascinating things as people start to look at that is how much that varies, and then also how that it seems to be linked to diet and the biodiversity of the diet. So you've got another system there that you're
yep.
kind of adding into the complexity. So I guess where do you see the interactions between those systems and how you monitor them? And then from a practical perspective, how do you not get overwhelmed by all these new sources of data and information? And how do you put it together in something that actually the rancher or the breeder can say, I'll use this for that?
Yeah, and I guess I would add one more layer of complexity there, being environment and management. So just picking a cow up who's in Tennessee and sticking her out in West Texas, maybe sort of around where my wife is from. Those are two completely different environments, right? We're here, we can graze, 300 plus days a year. Out there, cows have to flip rocks over to find a little bit to eat, right? The heat's different. The toxic fescue that our cows graze is another stressor. And then there's this management on top, right? We can have two neighbors whose cattle are managed quite differently, and those look like completely different environments, even though the zip code is exactly the same. So more supplementation is going to change and shift the composition of that rumen microbiome that you talked about. Is going to shift their ability to digest other foodstuffs. It's going to change that cow's efficiency. So there's so many moving pieces there. I think that as breeders, it's we have to consider all that. So we can't just look at our operation in a vacuum. But also, I think that a lot of the things and the tools that we work to develop are they're robust to that, right? We try and remove environment and focus just on genetics, but the next sort of evolution, I think, is going to be a little bit more environment aware genetic and genomic predictions. So layering on some of those management pieces and natural environmental stressors and trying to match specific genetics to certain environments, right? So a cow that really thrives because she's genetically predisposed to have a certain passage rate through her rumen, which allows certain microbes to colonize it. She's maybe going to be a better fit in sort of a low quality range environment, whereas another cow might be a better fit in this sort of high quality, improved pasture environment that we've got in the east of the Mississippi. So again, there's so many moving pieces, but I think our tools, like you said, we can actually observe the components or indicators, at least, of the composition of that rumen microbiome. We've got more information from satellite imagery that we can utilize to better predict what an animal's environment and management might look like. So as we figure out how to layer those pieces together and match genetics to specific environments, those are the things that I think I'm the most excited about. But it's a hugely complicated system that's going to take some time and effort to put all those disparate pieces together. But animal breeders can't just think about calculating their breeding values in a vacuum. There's going to be a lot more pieces of information and interactions that we've got to consider if we want to make better tools that allow producers to put animals in the right environments to succeed.
So in terms of that, what are you currently monitoring and measuring in terms of traits that you're putting into your research and your in terms of developing these breeding values?
Yeah, so I guess I'll take a step back and talk really broadly about sort of our theory as animal breeders is that we want to have some sort of a plan, right? We want to have goals that we're working towards, and that's going to differ from operation to operation. Whether people retain replacement females, how they market their calves is going to dictate the traits that go into their selection decisions. And so my job as a geneticist, I think, is to figure out what the missing pieces are there and how we might be able to measure those at the scale needed to make selection tools for producers. So, to me, when I sort of look at the landscape of things, anyone who's familiar with a bull sale catalog or an AI stud book, you open that up and it looks like the back of a baseball card, right? There's all these different estimated breeding values for traits from an animal's birth weight all the way through its carcass weight, for female fertility, for meat quality, everything in between. And so what I do there is I look and I say, what's missing from this picture? And in our part of the world, in Tennessee here, and overwhelmingly east of the Mississippi, we're cow-calf country, right? Very little feedlot, very little slaughter capacity here. So most of our cattle are getting shipped over out to the west to get fed. So the biggest dictator of success for producers in this part of the world is how efficient can that cow convert forage into milk into weaned calf pounds, right? And our best indicator of that at this point is how big that cow is, right? Bigger cows tend to be less efficient, smaller cows more efficient. And so I spend a lot of time with my extension hat talking about sort of these system level efficiencies. So, you might wean off less pounds of calf per cow, but with the smaller cow, you're actually able to stock more. You wean off more calf pounds per acre, which I think is a better sort of KPI, right? As we try and drill into what efficiency looks like. But as a geneticist, we want to find tools that allow us to tweak things. And the biggest missing piece in our evaluations at this point is cow efficiency on forage. So there's been a long time effort, probably over the last 2.5+ decades, of amassing feed efficiency records in more of a concentrate feedlot setting. And we've developed tools that allow selection explicitly for dry matter intake, for feed efficiency. But again, I think that environment in more of a feedlot setting is going to look very different from a cow that's efficient out grazing on grass, right? There's way more moving pieces when you put a cow out in her natural environment, right? She's got to be able to deal with environmental stressors. There's behavioral components to foraging. There's been some really interesting work on sort of how range cows graze, huge amount of that that appears to be genetically driven. And then there's really just the getting at the core needs of that cow, right? If you've got a lactating cow, how much energy does she need for maintenance? How much is she partitioning towards lactation, reproduction, all these other things that are essential to our profitability? And then you sort of step back another time and say, what's the biggest cost for a cow-calf operation? And the biggest variable cost across the board is cow feed costs. And we don't have a great selection tool immediately for just how much a cow eats when she's on forage. So my research program is really interested in finding and exploring new and novel ways of measuring and predicting cow efficiency in these more forage-based systems. So we lean on a lot of technologies from ear tag based wearables to measuring sort of the gases that a cow emits as proxies. It's very, very hard for us to actually go out and measure individual forage disappearance on cows, hugely impractical. So, our goal is to find good indicators that we could plug in as sort of stand ins for these traits and genetic evaluations and hopefully deliver tools at the end of the day that allow us to more precisely say this cow is more or less efficient rather than just saying this cow is big and this cow is little.
There's a lot of stuff there.
Yeah,
There's a lot of stuff there. One thing, so what the cow efficiency at the end of the day, it's the miles per gallon of that cow. It's whether
sure.
you've got the clunky old 1950s or 60s big
Yep.
car that churns through gas, or you've got something that's much more efficient.
Right.
Um, and in terms of looking at those emissions and trying to work out from that how efficient the animal is, um, I guess where's the science currently in that space? How much more research do we need to do? What do we already know? And the other side of it, I guess, is, what size is the data set? Do we have enough data, or do we need more data to be able to understand that better?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that the science has been around for a long time, right? So we've been putting cows in boxes and measuring what comes out of them since the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. A lot of that foundational sort of energetics work was done back in the 60s. And so that's sort of been, we've got a good understanding of sort of how cows use and produce energy. And I'm so far from an animal nutritionist that it's not even funny. You should talk to one of them a little bit more about what the state of their science is. But I guess, as geneticists, we're always sort of like, we need something that's good enough, right? We're never going to put every cow through a respiration chamber, right? That's our gold standard of measuring so many of these metabolic type things, right? But if I can get a cow to go stick her head into a thing, 3 or 4 times a week for 4 weeks, I start to get a pretty good understanding of what that cow's average emissions are. And from those emissions, whether it be methane, CO2, oxygen, we can start to piece together what that cow's metabolism underlying her really looks like. And so we're still really early stages in beef cattle in doing this. Much more work's been done in dairy because those cows are just more accessible, right? You stick a gas sensor in an automatic milking system. The cow's there between 2 and 4 times a day. You can amass records really, really quick. A beef cow who's out grazing, a 1,500-acre tract of land, comes by the water once per day, maybe sticks her head in a machine, once or twice a week, right? Amassing records is much more challenging, but I think is every bit, if not more important, due to the sort of heterogeneity of our beef herd, due to the variation in grazing systems and forage types. We're still really building a database that would allow us to start to do genetics on that. But I think is really, really important that we start to develop these indicators of our biggest variable costs on these cow-calf enterprises.
In terms of that, and this might be, I might be asking the nutritionist question rather than the geneticist question, so
Okay.
excuse me for that. But the our metabolism changes also with our health and also with what we eat.
Yep.
So if an animal then is moving, obviously one of the variables of grazing systems is that the feed source changes every single day. The grass grows, it's hot and it goes off, or it's dry, or it's frosty, or whatever
Right.
happens.
Yep.
So you've got this ever-changing nutritional quality. And is there, because you're getting other interactions between the animal and the animal's metabolism and where they are. And likewise, metabolism will go up if an animal's sick as they start burning energy in terms of driving the immune system, which
Yep.
means their amount of carbon dioxide they're respiring will go up.
Yep.
So it's untangling, I guess, what's the innate genetic side of things plus what's that environment, animal health interaction. And
Hmm.
then also, are there opportunities to extract data that a rancher could use to say, my animals are changing, I might need to up my management or further investigate. And then from the genetics perspective, you need to untangle those as well, because one's environmental and one's genetic.
Yeah, that's another really good question that gets sort of at the foundation of the difference between geneticists and nutritionists. So nutritionists want to understand that environmental piece, right? What's driving what I see in this animal? Geneticists want to say, once I take away that environmental piece, what am I left with? And what does that tell me about an animal's genetic potential so that I can make a decision about whether that goes on to the next generation or not? And so in our case, as geneticists, a lot of what we're doing is trying to model out that environmental noise, right? So the sort of overarching assumption there is that if I'm measuring one of these phenotypes, one of these metabolism phenotypes on 100 head of cows, they're out in the same pasture, have access to the same forage. As the forage dips in quality and quantity, that's going to equally affect all of my cows. I can use that contemporary group to pull out environmental variation, and what I'm left with is trying to disentangle that genetic piece a little bit more. So we're very interested in trying to remove that generally, but I think the more that we get into it, the more interested we're becoming in trying to understand how genetics work across that environmental gradient. So, are the genetics that make you efficient the same if you are grazing in the middle of June versus in October, right? Are different genetics better at grazing when grass is very plentiful? Do some, hold steady and then ratchet up when forage quality dips? We're starting to become more interested, and we've got the ability to start modeling some of those things, at least at the research level. But that's a huge outstanding piece, and you mentioned animal health. Uh, I think that that's probably our biggest blind spot right now from a genetic standpoint. How do you measure a phenotype of an animal's ability to stay healthy? It's really, really tricky, something that sort of keeps me up at night trying to figure out what that trait is. Your ability to resist local pathogens, but I put you in a different environment and you're sick right away versus a cow that's very robust to everything. It's a big outstanding question and certainly has impacts on how we identify these efficient animals and try and move them forward in our breeding programs.
On that note, I recently read a piece on human longevity
Mm.
and the genetic component of human longevity. This was just in the last week or so. And What the researchers found was the actual genetic component of longevity in humans was much, much higher than
Mm,
previously thought because they recrunched data over the last 50 or 100 years where
mm,
they'd taken out diseases, accidents, all those environmental factors that had
yeah,
reduced longevity and tried to focus on what was the genetic nature of it.
sure.
And that then leads back to your appropriate animal for the environment because you measure the animal when in springtime, but you can't just lock the animal in springtime for the whole year. They have to go through the summer and the fall and the winter as well.
Yep, yep. Yeah, and I think we're again as animal breeders, our biggest thing that we need is right? We need numbers of records, and so we're pretty unpicky with how and when we get those, right? There's sort of a trade-off, right, between record precision and the granularity of it, and the number of animals that you can measure, and so we've got to work and find an optimum. Rob Banks, who spent a long time at UNE and Agbu, has sort of worked in this space of optimized phenotyping and how we can strategically get the highest quality while maintaining the number of records that you need to do genetic evaluation. But your point stands, right? Would you rather have I would rather have 10 records from across the year on every cow. But if I'm left to either get 10% of the cows with 10 records or all of the cows with one record, I'm generally going to choose all of the cows with one record, knowing that that'll probably, if a cow's efficient in spring, the likelihood that she's efficient in fall is probably pretty high. But again, so much of what we do is try and understand, are those two things different traits? The big question right now, I think, is grazing efficiency the same trait as feedlot efficiency? I would tend to guess, again, not as a nutritionist, but those would seem to me to be pretty different traits. Just your ability to digest concentrate being quite different than that more the forage that those grazing cows are going to have. So those are all really good questions that I think we're all as an industry trying to get our hands on.
To go into the weeds on that a little bit, um, say you've monitored the cow in the fall in the springtime, and then you're monitoring a different mob later on in the year, and then you also then say weigh the animal in the fall,
Yep.
and you look at their body condition, something that may be a little less needs less equipment, less intensive. And can you then correlate if you've got ones that were doing really efficiently in the spring and then they're still looking healthy and they've still got good weight and their calf weight's good, so obviously the calf's grown and they produce enough milk.
Right.
And then you kind of link different data sources and connect them even though they're not directly comparable, they're the same data.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the really important thing amongst all of this is that we're never looking or we're never breeding for a single trait in a vacuum, right?
Yeah.
There's always pushes and pulls. So I could have the most metabolically efficient cow in my herd, right? She could have the lowest CO2 emissions, and we're using that as an indicator for cow metabolic efficiency. But if her calf is 100 pounds lighter than all of the other cows in the herd, and she comes through the chute post weaning at a body condition score of 3.5 or 4. She's just not eating very much and she's not producing very much, right? And that gets to your miles per gallon issue, right? If what is the animal actually doing with the resources that they're taking up? And so our selection programs tend to be quite broad, right? We're trying to touch all of the things that affect profitability in a herd. And so you've got your revenue generation, right? We can't give up so much on calf weight, but we also need to consider these costs, right? In trying to find that economically optimized sweet spot, I think is really what we're trying to do. And we have selection indexes that allow us to sort of appropriately weight all of the traits and how they relate to profit so that we're not ending up in a ditch on one side, right? I worry a little bit about the industry where we've got pressure to make carcasses bigger and bigger and bigger, as unfavorable genetic correlations with cow size and cow efficiency. And so, how do we do all of this in an optimized way that doesn't put us in one of the two ditches? I think is one of the big things that we've been dealing with in animal breeding since it became a thing.
And as with all these things, I guess there's a bit of a pendulum that will swing a little far to one side, and then we'll recorrect, and then go to the other side, and there'll be a bit of backwards and forwards there as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the most successful breeders of cattle, the people that have been in the business for the longest and are the most successful, are the ones that aren't reactionary in their breeding, right? They've got a clear breeding plan, a clear breeding objective. They know what their cattle do well, and they're working on, the suite of traits, and they're consistent through. Right now the market says make cattle as big as possible. But again, that pendulum is inevitably going to swing back the other way. The people that stay the course, right? They maybe don't get as big of a bump when the market is super high, but they're much, much more robust when the bottom falls out. And so, again, I think the people that have been in this business, for 100+ years that I know, have been very, very true to their breeding objective. They focused on making really practical cattle that fit their environment. And then, things change along the way. You have to pick up a new trait here or there, or switch your emphasis a little bit on things that are more longer lasting. But the folks that are robust to that pendulum swing are the ones that stay in the business and are the most successful.
You mentioned that as a geneticist, as big an N is possible is good. And so given that there's somewhere between 1 to 1.5 billion cattle in the world,
Yep.
what's the N we're looking for?
Oh, that's a hard question. It really depends what your end goal is, right? And in that N is very population specific. So, as a general rule, as we're trying to make these selection tools, estimated breeding values or expected progeny differences, EBVs or EPDs get used interchangeably. Sort of our baseline. A trait's got to be heritable to some degree, right? And your accuracy of that tool is going to depend on the heritability of the trait. That's going to affect how many phenotypes you need to measure. So if there's only 1% of a trait that's driven by genetics, you're going to have to observe it on a huge number of individuals, and able to be able to make a tool that allows you to select on the genetic component of that because it's just such a small slice of the pie. Making a genetic selection tool for something that's 50% heritable, you can have less records there. But the sort of starting point for a genetic evaluation, I think, is always in that 10,000 records range, is when you can start to be pretty confident in the tools that are coming out the other end there. But it's all sort of statistical accuracy, and there's a little bit of risk tolerance that goes with how much can I tolerate? What's sort of the opportunity cost of not having this tool versus waiting for it to be sort of fully mature and of a sufficient accuracy. So again, that's a classic academic and extension answer, but it really does depend. But I'd love to measure every 1 point, however many billion cows there are in the world. But again, that comes with its own challenges from production system to production system, from breed to breed.
And on that note, we've got the fact that, a lot of this is not just the animal, but also the animal and its interaction with its environment.
For sure.
And then if we start looking a bit further beyond North America and beyond Australia, and especially when we start to look at the global south and the tropical environments there
Yep.
and the indigenous breeds there, how, because there's so much knowledge created, how do we use what we're learning and what we're developing to have the broadest benefits across the global north and the global south?
Yeah, I think that those production environments are all in such a different we're sort of at different places along the along our progression in having selection tools. I do think that a lot of the the iterations of things that we've gone through in the global north, right? We've gone from, in the last since the 1960s, I guess, from no performance recording to having genomically enhanced breeding values for, 25 plus traits. I think as we look to the global south and we do some work in Kenya with the folks at the International Livestock Research Institute, sort of where we've gotten to is like we need data recording infrastructure is the first and foremost thing, right? How do we capture weights on animals? And once that happens, we can skip a couple steps, right? We don't have to work through the innovation in how we calculate EPDs based on pedigrees. We don't have to go through the however many different iterations of genomic selection that we've developed. We can leap a couple steps, and once you're routinely recording phenotypes on animals, once we've got fairly cheap genotyping, which is well on its way, we can develop really robust genetic selection programs pretty quickly. But again, it takes, at the end of the day, we've got to measure phenotypes on animals. But the rest of it, the infrastructure, the methodology to actually develop genetic selection tools is there. So I think that we can accelerate that in a number of ways, but it's really all about capturing measurements on those animals and having that in a place that allows you to do evaluation on it.
And then that, I guess, it feeds back into whatever the local conditions are and their ability to, and the ease to capture those phenotypes and that information and communicate it, and the capacity and the skills of the local population to do all that work as well.
Yeah, and that's I don't know, every time that I'm in Africa, I'm just amazed that cattle can live there, right? And the pastoralists that we work with are such good herds people and again, the ability to keep cattle alive in conditions like that, working against parasites and every tick-borne and fly-borne illness you can imagine. Those animals are survivors. And so, again, the ability to layer genetic improvement on top of these animals that are so adapted to such a harsh environment, I think there's tons and tons of potential in the global south to make those systems more productive. But again, it really all comes down to data recording and data infrastructure. But again, there's so much potential there, and there's a lot of energy. I think specifically focused on the on red meat, so whether that be beef, sheep, or goat, to really get those programs off the ground and get those populations better able to utilize those natural resources.
I think something to also add about the whole Africa side of things is the ability of that continent to grow grass is pretty impressive. And I was in Africa last year, and I saw a book on the different grass species, the native grass species, and I was pleasantly surprised by how many of those native African grass species you may find in a feed store as improved pastures in Eastern Australia and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, there's things more things go backwards and forwards each way than when we often give credit for.
Yeah, and the same with the cattle too, right? I think about if you want to model for animals that are incredibly robust to disease in stressful situations, you don't have to look any further than some of those native African breeds, right? And so is there genetics that some of our the global north could pull out of there that would help solve some of our challenges with emerging animal diseases or increased, extreme weather events, whatever that looks like, that those animals have been dealing with for the last, tens of thousands of years and are well adapted to. So again, I think there's so much two-way exchange of knowledge, exchange of germplasm and genetics, but it's really exciting when those things start to come together.
One of, I think, the most exciting areas of science that we're learning more and more about, from my perspective, is epigenetics.
Mm.
And that whole, so genetics, please add detail if this is not 100% correct, but my understanding is genetics is the hard-coded DNA, and the epigenetics is how those genes are actually expressed. So the way I think about it, the example I use, is that a child can be born with a certain eye color, and at a later stage in life, their eye color will change. But their DNA hasn't changed, their genetics haven't changed, but the way those genes have been expressed has changed. And that's that epigenetics. Where where do you see, or do you see, and if you do, where do you see potential in new and emerging areas such as epigenetics to kind of give us, even greater tools to improve the industry?
Yeah, epigenetics are they're still sort of the Wild West from a livestock perspective, right? I think the human community has poured a lot of resources into them in the context of disease in particular. But yeah, we're born with the exact same set of DNA that we've got now, minus and plus a few mutations. But again, the turning on and off of genes, it's something that we've known about for a long time, and probably the application, even though we haven't called it epigenetics, but we call it in cattle, it'd be fetal programming. So basically, what a mom's plan of nutrition is when she's pregnant is going to dictate in a lot of ways the performance of that calf, right? And there's been a lot of work in this sort of the intersection of reproduction and nutrition, understanding how to sort of optimize how we develop heifers, right? Does maybe some early nutrient restriction actually help that heifer cope better downstream? You make some of those epigenetic changes that turn genes on or off. And then downstream, she's better able to respond to that environmental challenge. And so I think that's something that's been on our mind. We probably haven't, as animal scientists, called it epigenetics. But for me, the biggest opportunity from a genetic standpoint is really changing how we think about prediction. So up to this point, like I've said, we record a phenotype, we pull that environmental variation out, and we've got an estimate of what an animal can pass down to its offspring, right? So we're very focused on not individual animal performance, but how will this animal's offspring perform compared to this animal's offspring. And so I think the exciting thing about epigenetics, or understanding things like we talk about gene expression, transcriptomics, or proteomics, or metabolite. We've got all these omicses, right? And the exciting thing for me is how do we take these and turn them into phenotypic predictions for an animal, right? Pull a sample of blood early on in an animal's life and say, based on these epigenetic marks, which are becoming more tractable to measure at scale. Like I've said, we're always interested in, and those are previously research tools. There have been some advancements in how we do that that I think will allow us to screen large numbers of animals for some well-known epigenetic marks in the near future. So, given that information, instead of just predicting what's the additive genetic potential of this animal, can we start to drill down on some of these things and say, hey, this animal has a lot of genetic potential, and it appears based on these epigenetic marks that this animal had a really favorable fetal environment, and this animal got all of the benefits of, it was vaccinated, it had good forage management of its dam, and it got all these benefits, right? This animal has the potential to grow really fast, have a really high meriting carcass, or be a very productive female. Epigenetics and some of these other omics things are going to allow us to drill in on predicting individual animal phenotype and managing them accordingly, rather than just saying something about the genetic component of a trait that really might not be that heritable. So in the future, and this is a ways off, but I can see, a feedlot gets a group of animals. They're pretty heterogeneous, maybe from 10 or 15 different operations, but they can start placing animals in individual pens and managing them as such, right? These animals, based on these epigenetic marks or this gene expression that we see, unlikely to get sick, even if there's a big outbreak around. Very robust immune systems. We can maybe put them in our antibiotic free pen over here. These animals were maybe a little bit higher risk based on those things. And they can do that in sort of a structured and I guess standardized manner. So I think it unlocks a lot of opportunities for doing individual animal management based on phenotypic predictions.
That is absolutely fascinating. That's very, very interesting. So almost an addition, like an epigenetic selection tool to what are those animals going to be more likely, you could put an extra X% starch in a diet and push some higher because you think they have the epigenetics to cope for that. That's absolutely fascinating. That's really interesting.
For sure. Yeah, and it's really filling in that, if a phenotype's 100% and, feed efficiency is 30% heritable, right, that we capture with our selection tool, there's another 70% that we can start to fill in the missing bits about as we try and predict how that animal will actually perform. So I think it's really, really exciting and has enormous implications for how we manage our cattle.
We're almost going up to time. So before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't already discussed?
Oh man, not that it wouldn't take an hour plus. I love these conversations that are just sort of open and free flowing, and I can talk about cows and beef production all day. But I think I'm really bullish on sort of the future of the beef industry. I think that there's so much meat that's left on the bone for us to get at from a genetics perspective. There's a whole suite of traits that we probably haven't been able to measure or touch in the past. We're starting to get the tools to get there. And at the end of the day, it's about making the best use of our natural resources, right? Living in harmony with the environment, putting these large ruminants in positions that they were designed to do, right? And that's turn grass into high quality protein. People still really like to eat beef. And so I think we've got a great story. We've got improving tools and genetics especially, right? It's this continual progress over time. It doesn't happen overnight, but the progress that you make is cumulative, right? We're not backsliding every generation. We're building on improvements, and for me, that's the exciting part is that we've had hundreds of years of selection to build on, but we're not losing that, and as long as we're working in the right direction, I think it's good news for beef production as I look forward. So it gets me out of bed every morning, and nothing I love to talk more about it. So I appreciate the opportunity to come on today, Ash.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Troy. Thank you so very much for joining me today.
You bet.
Thank you for listening to the Ash Cloud. Please subscribe to Ash Cloud if you've enjoyed this podcast, where I will continue to discuss food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental, political, and cultural challenges facing our society and creative ideas on how to address them.